2 years ago, a little anime called Frieren started airing, and it was vibrant. So, like any self-respecting game master, when something inspires me, my first instinct is to steal it and turn that into a tabletop RPG campaign. After all, Frieren is part of the single oldest storytelling tradition. It's a road trip story, just like the Lord of the Rings, the Odyssey, Journey to the West, or the Muppet movie. Now, I had done campaigns with a lot of travel before, but the players always had a home base to return to, a true road trip campaign, one where you would leave your home base on session 1 and only return to it 50 sessions later during the epilogue. That was something I had never done and I wanted to try it. So I ran a campaign just like this for about a year, and let me tell you, it did not go well. My players had fun, I think. Wait, dude, did you have fun?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. But as a GM, it was kind of miserable. So for Fey Week this year, I want to tell you about 4 pitfalls you will run into when running a road trip adventure, and give you techniques so you can avoid them, because that is what Himmel the hero would do. First, let's talk about why, despite sounding like freedom, exploration, or wandering an open world, road trip campaigns are actually one of the easiest ways to accidentally railroad your players. I'll walk you through an example session from a road trip campaign to show you how this works in practice. And I'm going to use Earth as the setting, just to make the examples easier to follow. If you want to make it sound more like a D&D campaign, you can just imagine that there's a bunch of weird fantasy creatures like dragons, elves, and French people running around. During session 0, you tell your players that the campaign will be a road trip where they will walk from Paris all the way to Singapore, a trip that would take them an entire year by foot one way. So they look at the world map you drew and go, okay, we're going to go through Germany, then Czechia, then Ukraine, etc. And then you start playing and your players go through Germany, then Czechia, then Ukraine, etc. Do you start to see the problem here? Your players haven't really made a single decision about where to go next since all the way back in session 1. And that wasn't even really a decision they made, they just measured the shortest path to the destination that you, as the GM, had decided for them. You're doing a campaign about travel in a game about making decisions, and there are no decisions about travel. I think that's a bit of a problem. So the first thing a road trip campaign needs is a setup that makes sure it leaves space for your players to make decisions. And there's a couple interesting ways to do that. The easiest way is to give your players a goal that is not one specific location, but a range of locations. For example, maybe your world is tidally locked. It's always facing the same side to its sun, which means there's a permanent day side and a permanent night side. And the player characters are on a mission to recharge a stash of magic items that regain their magic every day at dawn. So they need to make it from the day side to the night side and then back again. But that's not a location. That's a longitude. They could make the crossing here, or over there. They could decide to cross here on session 1, then learn something on session 10 that makes them go, actually we'll cross over there instead, and oh, look, just like that, your players have made a decision. They've changed their minds and affected the story of your campaign as a result. It's almost like they were playing a good tabletop RPG campaign. Or maybe your players have a bounty on their heads, so their goal is to make it to a different country. You start the campaign in the middle of a huge empire like the Roman Empire at its peak, and your party succeeds if they make it past any part of the border. Problem being, of course, some parts of the border are war zones, other parts are heavily guarded, and other parts are borders to other countries that are actually allied with the empire, so they'll deport you back home if they find you. A third option could be that your players are on an interplanar diplomatic mission. They need to get one god from the upper planes, doesn't matter which one, and one demon lord from the lower planes, doesn't matter which one. Put them in the same room and get them to enter a truce so they can focus on the common enemy of Nidhogg, who's currently trying to eat the entire multiverse. Once you introduce a setup that's flexible like this, if we graph that campaign, we don't get a line anymore. We get something that looks a bit more like a radial tree. Or in other words, we let the journey decide what the destination is, not the other way around. But that was just the first reason why a road trip campaign might fail. Let's talk about the second one, the lack of consequences. Your players make it to the gnomish city of Frankfurt. They have a cool adventure there, and then your players leave. They continue their journey, they make it to Prague, Kiev, etc., and none of the characters they met back in Frankfurt ever make an appearance again. The entire point of a road trip campaign is that this is a long, difficult journey, which almost always means that the player characters are pretty much the only people making that trip. That's what makes them the protagonists. But then 2 story arcs later, you realize as a GM, how do you pay off the decisions your players made all the way back in Frankfurt? None of the factions you introduced back then matter anymore, they don't have an influence here. And even if you introduce a new NPC called Little Hans, who is from Germany but for some reason lives in New Delhi, why would that character know or care about the actions your players took 6 months ago and half a planet away? And this also extends to any backstory NPCs that your players come up with. If your players have rivals, enemies or loved ones to protect, but all of those people are over here and all of the adventure is over there, then you're not going to have the ability to make any of your players' backstories matter. So the second thing a road trip campaign needs is a way for consequences to stick with your party. Let's go through a couple really effective ways to make that happen. One possibility is that maybe the player characters are not traveling alone, but instead they are part of a caravan with a dozen carriages and about 50 people. So those 50 people, they're essentially a small village that travels along with the party. And throughout the adventures your players have, maybe some of those characters will die or be left behind, or maybe your players will pick up new people to travel with. But where it gets really good is when you start to ask yourself, what can you do with those extra characters? Maybe your players help a faction in your world, and as a reward, that faction sends their master blacksmith, the dwarf Bogdan, to tag along with their journey, and now your party has someone who can craft or even improve magic weapons. Maybe one day your players discover that half their food supply is missing, and when they investigate, they find this kid called Raphael, who stowed away on their carriage. So now they need to decide what to do with the kid. Maybe when your players are looking for a guide, they stumble upon this shifty little dude called Mulog, and now your players will spend the rest of the adventure wondering whether or not they can trust him. That way, instead of your players traveling to where the narrative takes place, the narrative travels alongside with your players. And those 3 NPCs, they're actually part of a list of 15 non-player characters, each with their own little adventure seeds, and you can find them in a PDF on my Patreon right now. And the cool thing is that everything I put on Patreon is designed to be stuff you could use in any D&D campaign, not just a road trip campaign specifically. That includes these 15 NPCs, it also includes everything I've put on there in the past and everything I'll put on there with future videos. So if that sounds interesting, check out the link in the video description. But for now, let's go back to talking about how to steal Tolkien's entire vibe. Besides introducing new NPCs, there's a couple other ways to create stories that span across borders. And you already know one if you've watched my video about Daggerheart's starter adventure. In that adventure, the players are carrying a package, and none of them know what it is except for one player character, the mage, who is responsible for that package's delivery. So just by having this plot device, you introduce some tension within the party. Will people go behind the mage's back to take a peek at what they're transporting? It gives your players material to bounce off of during campfire scenes. So those scenes get to be about more than just who takes the next watch. If your players have a vehicle, that's also a great way to introduce some long-term consequences, as long as you don't just treat that vehicle as a weapon to be used during vehicle combat, but also as a home base that can be customized or improved over time. It could be a spelljammer ship, one of those mechanical cities for mortal engines, or even just a normal carriage, but with a portal to a demiplane on it, so it's bigger on the inside and now your players can customize it, maybe even using the Bastion rules if you're playing 5e. In a sense, the hero's journey is all about change, so as a GM, if you can give your players stuff to help make that change happen, you're on a pretty good track. But let's continue our little scenario because we've only just scratched the surface of everything that could go wrong with this type of campaign. You start your adventure and your players go on their journey. They travel through France, you run maybe 2 sessions worth of travel encounters, then they go through Germany and it takes them 4 days, so you prepare 4 more travel encounters. Now, those encounters, they are not just 3d6 wolves. You're a good GM, you have listened to all of the advice that I and a bunch of other tabletop YouTubers have given you about how to make travel encounters actually fun. So you don't just roll on a random table and call it a day. Instead, each travel encounter is a little self-contained adventure. Your campaign feels very episodic. Each week, there's a new villain, a new objective, a new difficult situation, a new moral dilemma. And that is why your campaign dies. Because having to come up with all of that every single week, it's taxing as a GM. And the thing is, you probably already know how to have a more sustainable pacing. You just need to actually apply it to a road trip campaign as well, even if it's slightly unintuitive. In a normal D&D campaign, you usually have some narrative arcs that can last 5 to 10 sessions, and you only have to do that initial prep of coming up with villains, plot hooks, situations, etc. once. And maybe that takes you an entire afternoon, but after that, for the next couple months, you just need to prepare a few stat blocks, maybe a battle map, and that's your entire prep for that week. So by the time you get to the end of that narrative arc, you've got plenty of time to find that one extra afternoon you needed to think about the next arc after that. But with a purely episodic campaign, you're doing that extra work every single week. It's not sustainable. So the third thing a road trip campaign needs is variety in its pacing. You need to introduce those narrative arcs back in your campaign. But what's important here is that the travel is still the point. It's still where the story happens. In Frieren, the biggest emotional beats of the story, like meeting Zahen and Stark or cleaning Himmel's statue and slowly realizing what he meant to the people around him, those all happen during travel encounters, not during the big fancy narrative arcs. But by having those big fancy narrative arcs, you give yourself the time you need to make those smaller, shorter moments matter. So look at your world map. Identify the biggest towns and the biggest natural obstacles that your party is likely to want to go through, and then you go, okay, in the Goliath settlement of Amsterdam, I'm gonna need 5 sessions worth of content. And that brings us to the last pitfall you need to be careful about. After about 6 days of walking, your players make it to Amsterdam and you've got a bunch of cool stuff prepared. Factions, NPCs, voices, lore. You're ready for your players to spend 5 to 10 sessions here. Game night happens and your players walk past the city. Why? Well, they don't care about Amsterdam. You told them the goal was to go to Singapore, so they're going to go to Singapore. And unless you do something about it, it's going to be in the most boring, efficient, risk-averse way possible. So the final thing your road trip campaign needs is a reason for them to not just walk past location, but to walk into locations. Frieren actually has a plot device they use for this, but it's really hard to make it work for D&D. In Frieren, the party often runs out of the money they need for their food, and that's what forces them to interact with the local population. Now in D&D, with just one bag of holding, your players will already be able to carry enough rations that they'll only need to stop once every couple months. And then you have to worry about the fact that druids and rangers exist. There are 2 popular optional rules that can help you deal with this though. The first is that you only let your players take long rests while they're in a safe haven, like a roadside inn or a city. And the other is gritty realism, where short rests take 8 hours and long rests take 7 days. So in both of these cases, instead of dealing with food attrition, you deal with hit points attrition as an abstraction for the party's overall comfort level. An abstraction that is way harder for your players to trivialize. But personally, I find it way easier to just introduce a new thing entirely that forces your players to make regular stops. Here's a couple ways that work really well. Maybe your players are transporting a dangerous artifact, sealed in a magic container that must be recharged at least once a week inside of a temple, otherwise the dark magic inside will leak out. Or maybe your party is transporting someone who is sick or cursed, so they need medical assistance every couple of days. And if you're playing in a Spelljammer setting, Spelljammer ships actually have a built-in plot device that does this perfectly. The more time you spend traveling, the less breathable the air becomes aboard the ship. So every now and then, you need to dock at a spaceport and literally get a bit of fresh air. If you have something like this, your players now have a reason to not just think about their destination, but also about the next step of their journey, to go inside of a city, to meet the people who live there, and maybe more importantly, a reason to want to do things for these people, to try to be in their good graces. Because otherwise, that ritual or that medical assistance that your players need, it's not gonna happen. And with that, you should have all the tools you need in your toolbox to run an actual epic hero's journey. You have a framework that will give your players choices, that will then give those choices lasting consequences, that will include adventure hooks so that you can actually present those choices to your players, and all of that with a pacing that is actually sustainable for you as the GM. This video was part of Fey Week, a yearly event organized by Pointy Hat and GDD, where dungeon tubers gather and make videos about the Fey for 1 week. For example, here's a video by actual Fey person who stole my name, Val from France, about how the Fey give us a perfect template for how to traumatize our players and make them afraid of everything. And here's one by the Grungeon Master who specializes in world building, and who will spend 20 minutes explaining all of the reasons why centaurs kind of suck, actually. And finally, special thanks to my Patreon members at the All-Seeing tier: Rafa, Michael Fremod and Ebert. Make sure you check out the link in the description if you want to get the PDF with the 20 companion NPCs and be as cool as them. Okay, bye!